This is chapter 7, applying the redundancy principle. For this slide, we're talking about principle 1, choose between narration and on-screen text. This research shows that learning is optimized when graphics are accompanied by audio narration. However, research also tells us that learning is hindered when graphics are accompanied by both audio narration and on-screen text. In this case, the on-screen text becomes redundant to the audio narration, that creating an unnecessary cognitive load and impeding the learner's ability to process the income information. This is the guiding theory behind e-learning's redundancy principle. We are talking about the psychology behind this principle. The redundancy principle is rooted in the cognitive theory of multimedia learning, which states that learners have separate channels for processing audio and visual information. Each of these channels has an upper limit, and that learners will work to construct mental models using income information. In the case of graphics with narration, the narration is processed through the learner's auditory channel, while the graphics are processed through the learner's visual channel. Redundant on-screen text is also processed via the visual channel, forcing the learner to process twice the amount of visual information, leading to cognitive overload and impeding overall learning. So it's important to keep in mind that more information doesn't equate to greater learning. In this e-learning example, the learner sees an image alongside on-screen text while hearing the same text narrated. Since both the on-screen text and graphic are received through the visual channel, the existence of both in the activity increases the learner's cognitive load and causes extraneous processing. In addition, some learners may find themselves trying to compare the on-screen text to the narration, further increasing extraneous processing. In this example, the on-screen text has been removed from the learning activity, but the narration remains. But removing the on-screen text, the learner's visual and auditory channels are balanced. This reduced the cognitive load the learner experiences. There are special situations in which having audio narration and on-screen text would be acceptable. The key is to avoid overloading the learner's visual information processing system. For example, there is no presence of pictures, such as including videos and graphics. There is less of a chance of overloading the learner and their processing of this new information, because they can give the narration their undivided attention, as opposed to being distracted by an excess of things coming them at once. It could also be acceptable to use both audio narration and pictures in situations where only a few keywords are used. This could actually enhance rather than detract from understanding if done correctly. Finally, if the learner at hand cannot process spoken words, such as a learner with a disability or who is unfamiliar with the language, there would be no harm in using it, as it would be likely to overload them in the same cognitive way. When considering this exception to the redundancy principle, the most vital piece is whether the learner's process demands are being diminished in any way due to the overload of information, or does the information ultimately work in cooperation with each other to enhance overall learning and processing of new information? These are the visual and verbal channels working in cooperation or against each other as the learner processes each new piece of information. Redundant wording impedes learning, but carefully placed words can result in both channels working together by carefully getting this learner's attention. This is the example of narrate on screen text. This would read more quickly to themselves than the narrator. This situation causes cognitive overload on learners. According to the clock, the students used narration and redundant on-screen text performed worse than the students who used narration alone. This is the example of an e-learning tool with narration alone. The strength of narration alone is the student focus listening to the text and watch the visual design at the same time. This explains the balanced two channels, visual and auditory. Now test your understanding of the redundancy principle by reviewing the question on the next slide.